Most people think they're alive. They wake up, go to work, pay their bills, smile in photos. They have names, routines, and roles: father, employee, friend. But if you look deeper, you'll see something hollow behind their eyes. Not death, something worse: a life unlived. They didn't choose their path. They inherited it, like a dusty suit that never quite fits. And every day, they tighten the tie of expectations just a little more, until they forget what breathing felt like. Here's the question Nietzsche would whisper into their ear: what if the person you've become is the very thing standing between you and freedom? That question doesn't comfort, it wounds. Because deep down, they know. They've been keeping a version of themselves alive that should have died a long time ago. The people watching this right now, you may already feel it. That quiet, gnawing ache. That sense that you're meant for something more. But you're trapped in who the world told you to be. You dress up your past mistakes and call it maturity. You silence your curiosity and call it responsibility. You bury your wildness and call it wisdom. But what if that's not wisdom? What if it's fear in disguise? Nietzsche didn't believe in comfort. He believed in fire, in destruction, in rebirth. He believed that freedom has a cost, and that cost is you. Not the real you. The version of you built to survive, not to live. The obedient one, the cautious one, the people pleaser. That self must be sacrificed. And until you hold a funeral for that identity, until you let it burn, you'll never touch real freedom. Only shadows of it. This video is not here to give you steps. It's here to give you permission to grieve the person you no longer need to be, to kill the illusion, so the truth can breathe again. Because in Nietzsche's words, though he never said them quite like this, freedom demands a funeral. Are you ready to bury the lie you're living? You felt it already, that strange, uncomfortable truth. To become who you're meant to be, you must first destroy who you were told to be. This wasn't just philosophy for Nietzsche, it was war. He believed that every individual is born as raw potential, but that society, family, and culture immediately begin shaping that potential into something tame, predictable, and acceptable. From a young age, we are taught to obey, to follow the script, to play the part. And by the time we realize we're wearing a mask, it's been glued to our face for decades. Nietzsche called this false self the herd identity, a version of you sculpted by comfort and control. It's safe, it's polite, but it is not free. And so he gave a brutal warning. You must become who you are. But to do that, the current version of you must die. Not physically, psychologically, spiritually. A funeral of your false identity. Because real freedom does not arrive gently. It demands blood, sweat, loss. And that's where most people stop. Right there, at the edge of transformation, looking over the cliff, terrified of what they'll lose if they jump. They ask, but what if I disappoint everyone? What if I fail without the structure that's kept me safe? What if I become someone I no longer recognize? But Nietzsche's answer was simple. You already are someone you no longer recognize. That's the problem. He wasn't romantic about freedom. He saw it as a violent rebirth. And like all births, it begins in darkness. This is where the pain lives, the part of the journey where you feel lost, detached, uncertain. But Nietzsche knew this is exactly where freedom begins. Not in finding yourself, but in forging yourself. Not in comfort, but in confrontation. You do not awaken by adding more. You awaken by burning away what was never yours. So the next time you feel lost, good. That means something false inside you is dying, and something honest is trying to be born. Let's go deeper. The hardest chains to break are the ones we don't even see. Because even when the mask cracks, when the old self begins to rot, we cling to it, not because it's good, but because it's familiar. We've built our entire identity on this version of ourselves. The one that says yes to what it doesn't want. The one that stays quiet when it wants to scream. The one that endures just to be accepted. And there's a twisted comfort in that. Comfort in predictability. Comfort in being needed, even if it's only because we've been obedient. This is what Nietzsche called the prison of moral conformity, where we trade authenticity for approval. Where our values aren't truly ours, but borrowed from tradition, religion, or the expectations of others. And when that version of us is threatened, the body reacts like it's dying. Because in many ways, it is. Our nervous system resists change. Our ego resists death. Our social wiring fears exile. So even when a better version of you calls from the other side, you hesitate, you stall, you invent reasons to delay the funeral. I'll change when I have more time. I can't risk upsetting people right now. This is just who I am. But deep down, you know that voice is lying. It's not your soul speaking. It's your survival instincts. And Nietzsche believed that survival is not the goal of life. Transcendence is. The reason most people never transform isn't because they can't. It's because the coffin of who they were still feels warmer than the cold air of who they could become. They would rather suffer predictably than suffer purposefully. But suffering is coming either way, and only one kind leads to rebirth. This is the moment Nietzsche demands your honesty. Are you protecting your comfort or protecting your potential? Because one of them has to die, and you already know which one deserves the funeral. You know what's strange? No one throws a funeral for the self they've outgrown. There's no ceremony, no mourning, no final words, only silence and a subtle ache that something inside us is fading. But Nietzsche knew something must die for something greater to be born. The problem is, no one teaches us how to grieve the person we no longer want to be. The funeral of the old self is a quiet death. Not dramatic, not visible, but deeply personal. And it's terrifying because it feels like stepping into a void without a map. You lose your labels. You lose your roles. You lose the familiar lies that kept your world stitched together. It feels like betrayal to your past, to your family, to the story you've always told yourself. But here's the truth. Nietzsche carved into philosophical stone. You are not obligated to remain the person you were yesterday. The tragedy is not change. The tragedy is stagnation in the name of loyalty to a version of yourself that was built to survive, not to thrive. And so, most people skip the funeral. They wear the corpse of who they were like armor. They decorate it with productivity, performance, and polite smiles. But underneath, they've stopped living. Because to truly live, to be free, requires death. Death of the approval addict. Death of the false caretaker. Death of the image you curated to feel safe in a world that never really saw you. And no, the world won't clap when you bury that version of you. They might resist. They might criticize. They might say, "You've changed." But that's the point. Real change demands grief. It demands discomfort. It demands a eulogy to everything that kept you small. And in that moment, if you dare to let go, truly let go, you begin to feel something you haven't felt in years. Lightness, clarity, an unexplainable peace. Because you're no longer dragging the weight of a self that was never fully yours. And that's the funeral Nietzsche was talking about. A sacred death. So that something wild, honest, and alive can finally take its first breath. Something is born the moment you bury the old self. But it doesn't arrive gently. It comes with fire. And that fire doesn't just warm you, it burns you. It scorches the mask you've worn for years. The one you carefully stitched together out of politeness, approval, and fear. That mask was never your face. It was survival. It was strategy. It was your way of fitting in, even if it meant carving yourself down to someone else's shape. But the fire doesn't care about your reputation. It doesn't care about your carefully built image. It only cares about truth. And when you stand in that flame long enough, something remarkable happens. You begin to see what was always underneath. Not the version of you that knew the right things to say. Not the one that smiled through resentment. Not the one that accepted less because they were told they were too much. But the real you. The raw, unshaped, untamed version that doesn't beg to be chosen because it already knows its worth. This is what Nietzsche called becoming the Übermensch. Not a superior human, but a sovereign one. A person who no longer borrows their value from culture, tradition, or others. A person who writes their own scripture, burned clean of inherited guilt and secondhand morality. But make no mistake, the fire will test you. It will ask you to say no when it's easier to say yes. It will ask you to walk away from people who only love the version of you that stays small. It will ask you to sit in solitude while the ashes of your past settle around your feet. And it will whisper, if this isn't who you are anymore, then who will you become? That's not a question you answer with words. It's a question you answer with how you live. So don't run from the fire. Don't numb it. Don't escape it. Don't call it something it's not. Because the fire isn't your enemy. It's your transformation. Let it burn. Once the fire has passed, once the old self is ash and the mask has melted, something quiet settles in. Not applause, not certainty, but stillness. And in that stillness, Nietzsche's final truth echoes back to you. Become who you are. Not who you were told to be. Not who you were praised for being. Not who you pretended to be to survive the roles you were cast in. But you. Unfiltered. Uncomfortable. Unrepeatable. It sounds simple. But this is the hardest truth of all. Because becoming who you are means you have to meet yourself for the first time. And that version doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes they're awkward. Sometimes they're angry. Sometimes they have desires you buried years ago because they didn't fit your brand. But Nietzsche's point was this. Freedom isn't about escaping the world. It's about escaping the lie of who you thought you had to be. And that's terrifying. Because when you no longer serve the expectations of others, when you no longer chase the love you never got, when you no longer need the script handed to you by society, you're left with something radical. Choice. Who do you become when no one is clapping? What path do you walk when the map is gone? What does your voice sound like when it's no longer edited for approval? This is where the real work begins. Not becoming someone new, but returning to the person you were before the world told you who to be. It's not glamorous. There's no finish line, no viral moment. Just an ordinary life that feels honest, and maybe for the first time, peaceful. Because freedom isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. It just is. And the moment you stop performing, the moment you bury the old self, not in bitterness, but in reverence, you begin to feel it. That quiet knowing, that gentle strength, that undeniable truth. You finally come home to yourself. So here you are, at the threshold. The funeral is over. The old self has been laid to rest, not with cruelty, but with compassion. And now, the silence after the burial asks you one final question. Will you walk forward as the version you've always been? Or will you return to the grave and resurrect what was comfortable, familiar, and false? This is the moment most people miss, because transformation doesn't come with fireworks. It doesn't announce itself with confidence. It comes quietly. It comes disguised as doubt. It shows up as small choices. Saying no when it's easier to comply. Walking away from someone who only loved your mask. Starting again, even if no one is watching. Trusting your voice when it still trembles. That's the truth Nietzsche knew, and feared most people would ignore. Freedom doesn't just demand a funeral. It demands a commitment to live in a world where you no longer hide, where you disappoint the right people, where you choose truth over peace, where you risk being misunderstood in order to be fully seen. And when it gets hard, and it will, remember this: the world doesn't need more versions of the same person. It doesn't need another voice echoing what's already been said. It doesn't need another smile stretched over a silent screen. It needs you, not the perfect you, not the polished you, the real one, the raw one, the one who's still healing but dares to speak anyway. So take the first step, imperfect, uncertain, and alive. Let your funeral be your birth. Let your silence be your strength. Let your truth be the torch that lights the next path. And if you're still scared, that's okay. Freedom never feels safe at first, but it's yours now, not because it was granted, but because you were brave enough to grieve. So go, build a life that would make your buried self proud. And if you ever forget the cost of staying small, just whisper it back to yourself. Freedom demands a funeral. Yours truly, Nietzsche.